Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome from the Atomic Museum, Mr. Rob McCoy.
Good evening, everybody.
No.
Probably so. Ooh. That's scary. Good evening, everybody. How are you? Was that food fantastic or what? They are just superb with the food. Well, welcome to ATOMIX number 3. It's hard to believe this is our 3rd ATOMIX event. And as those of you who have been here before know, this is a conversation, not a lecture, and so we want you to be prepared to ask any and every question that you have for our special guests tonight. This evening would not be possible without our sponsors. You see them up here on the screen. Prism Global Management, Live Well, Work Well, Mary Beth Hartlib, thank you. KM, who wants to remain anonymous. KM is here, by the way, but I'm not going to identify KM. And IHI Corporation, Leticia Rodriguez, is she here? She did not make it this evening. But anyway, those are our sponsors. We want to thank them. To lead our conversation tonight, it's our Director of Education, Matt Malinowski.
Welcome, everybody. Again, thank you for being here for ATOMIX. This is a fun event for us where we get to come out into the community, meet with all of you, have interesting, fun, unique conversations with some pretty spectacular guests. And tonight is no exception. We're going to talk about the Definitive Oppenheimer with filmmaker Jon Else in just a moment here. As Rob said, there will be time at the end of our kind of show and tell with some of Jon's clips for you to ask questions and have a conversation with Jon as well. With that, Jon Else is the director of the documentary program at UC Berkeley's Graduate School of Journalism. His documentaries, The Day After Trinity, J. Robert Oppenheimer and the Atomic Bomb, as well as Wonders Are Many, The Making of Dr. Atomic, have seen a surge of renewed interest after this year's blockbuster release of Christopher Nolan's Oppenheimer. Everybody, please help me welcome to our stage Jon Else. Welcome, Jon. Welcome. Yeah. Got a mic there? Perfect. All right. So before we really get started this evening, Jon, I know that there was a moment this week where both I think he and I were a little bit concerned about the possibility of Jon being able to make it into town, into Las Vegas. Jon, are you willing to share that story with us?
Oh, well, as of a couple of days ago, I was snowbound up at Lake Tahoe. And I had been snowbound for 6 days, actually in a subdivision with about 7 feet of snow in the streets. And I didn't think I was going to be able to get out, so we were actually poking around making plans to get me a snowmobile to get me out so I could get to the Reno airport and make it down here because I support the mission.
Well, thank you so much for being here tonight. We can't say thanks enough for Jon for making the effort, surviving the snowstorm. Here's what he was dealing with. So here's a quick look. So we had that huge windstorm. Jon was snowed in instead. Jon, I thought it would be fun to kind of introduce our audience to a lot of the other projects that you've worked on as well. We'll talk a lot about his films that feature Oppenheimer and the story of the Manhattan Project. But Jon's had an incredible career in film. And so what I'm going to do, if it's okay with you, is just kind of throw some slides up on the screen here. Just take a couple seconds, 30 seconds or so, and let us know what they are and how you were involved. So here we go. So here's the first one, Jon. We've got Sing Faster.
Well, I've done a lot of films about opera, and I discovered long ago that there's a world of ring cycle fanatics out there. Wagner's ring cycle. They're like deadheads. Yeah. So I condensed Wagner's 17-hour ring cycle into a 1-hour documentary. It was great fun.
All right, here's our next one. It's Neil Young, Rust Never Sleeps.
Yeah, I did a bunch of filming with Neil Young over the years. He was the most gracious, rock and roll star I've ever been around. Just a lovely, lovely guy. He is as nice a person as he seems.
Oh, great. Yeah. How about this one, Top Gun?
Top Gun. I can't take much credit for that. I worked on the special effects unit on Top Gun, and it involved filming model MiG jet fighters made out of a material called pyroplastic that they would load up with miniature explosives and gasoline, and they'd blow them up in midair. Now, I'm not a special effects guy, and the reason they hired me was because I'm a documentary filmmaker, and they wanted to shoot all this stuff handheld. Wow. So it had this, like, realistic look to it. So it was hard because it was these huge 35 millimeter cameras. But that was my moment with Tony Scott.
With Top Gun.
Yeah.
All right. Here's our next one. It's Cadillac Desert.
Cadillac Desert, we spent a lot of time in Las Vegas, actually, on Cadillac Desert. Cadillac Desert is a 4-part series about the rearranging of water in the American West. I grew up in the West. I assume a lot of you did. The way water flows in the West these days is not the way God made it. And so we spent a lot of time in Las Vegas with your wonderful former director of your water department, Patricia Mulroy. And yeah, it was great fun.
How about Land of Gold?
Land of Gold, this is a new film that I did that's going to be on public television this fall, and it's about the California gold rush. I grew up in Sacramento, California, and we had a very rosy view of the California gold rush and what happened with the 49ers. Turns out it depends on whose point of view that is. Mm-hmm. So this is the story really of a couple of 49er women and the troubles that befall them as they try to deal with this enormous influx of miners. I guess that has a familiar ring around here, right?
Yeah. How about for National Geographic, Inside Guantanamo?
Yeah, I spent a couple of weeks, actually about 6 weeks, at the prison camp at Guantanamo, and it was, we were talking at lunch today, it was a real life-changing experience. There were a lot of contradictions tied up in that experience, and
sure.
I'll be happy to talk with anyone offline about that.
And then we've got Eyes on the Prize.
Eyes on the Prize was a series about the American Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s, sort of the classic civil rights movement. And it was an incredible experience. I had actually been involved in the civil rights movement myself, and then I came back to help produce this series about it. And I wrote a book about it.
And yeah, so kind of the follow-up here is True South, right?
Yeah,
so
True South, yep. Yeah, it's about the making of that television series. Makes a lovely gift.
Well, thanks for playing our little get-to-know Jon Else game. So let's switch gears here. So we're going to start to talk about Oppenheimer a little bit. How were you drawn to projects focused on Oppenheimer? And Jon's, again, from UC Berkeley, Oppenheimer has a big connection to that. Did that drive any of this?
No, not at all. No, my interest in this subject, in nuclear weapons and nuclear testing and arms control, dates back to my upbringing. I grew up in Sacramento, California, at the center of a ring of about 5 very high-value targets, Air Force bases. I grew up during the height of the Cold War, where nuclear peril was just part of our life, 24/7. We listened to Tom Lehrer songs. I actually saw a test. I mean, this is probably the only audience I'll ever talk to where saying that I saw a test is like no big deal. To most of Americans, it's a big deal. Yeah, when I was about 9 years old, my dad took me out in the backyard one morning, and we looked to the south, and 300 miles from the test site, and it's the old cliche, the sun rose in the wrong direction. In those days, they announced a lot of the tests beforehand in the newspaper. It was with the weather forecast. Yeah, seriously, in the Sacramento Bee, it'd be like, cloudy with
chance
A-bombs.
of bomb, yeah.
Yeah.
Mushroom cloud.
And so I went to film school, became a filmmaker, and I had never really thought about Robert Oppenheimer. I mean, Robert Oppenheimer had sort of disappeared from cultural sight by 1977, which is when we started to make this movie. After his security hearing, he vanished. His public persona sort of vanished. So I really didn't know much about him. I thought he was still alive, actually, when I thought about doing a film about him.
Well, so this is the first film, right? So the day after Trinity is your first movie.
Yeah, well, it's the first big film I made. It's also the very, very first film about Robert Oppenheimer. When we started this project, there was literally not a single film about Oppenheimer. There was not a biography of Oppenheimer. There are two pretty good books about the Trinity shot and one book about the Oppenheimer security hearing. But otherwise, it was sort of a desert out there. Since then, I mean, there's a giant Oppenheimer industry now. There's a cavalcade. There's like fire hose of, there's Chris Nolan's new film.
Yeah.
There are books and plays and plots and novels and subplots and novels. On the plane coming down here, I read a new comic book about Robert Oppenheimer. There's even an epic poem. There's a very good long poem called Critical Mass by John Cannaday. So there's, so what that means is we were stuck with making the very first film about Oppenheimer. I had planned to do this very sort of imagistic, time-fractured movie. Mm-hmm. I had planned actually to do what Christopher Nolan finally did, but we realized that we couldn't do that. We really had to do a sort of a primer, a very straight ahead.
So let's go ahead and we'll take a look at the opening sequence from the day after Trinity, and we'll come back after that.
Yeah,
so
yeah. This is about 9 or 10 minutes.
Yeah. So enjoy, everybody.
In August of 1945, the city of Hiroshima was destroyed in about 9 seconds by a single atomic bomb. The man responsible for building the bomb was a gentle and eloquent physicist named J. Robert Oppenheimer. This is the story of Robert Oppenheimer and the atomic bomb.
Stinson Beach, California, August 7th, 1945. Dear Oppie, you are probably the most famous man in the world today, and yet I am not sure that this letter will reach you. But if it does, I want you to know that we are very proud of you. And if it doesn't, you will know it anyway. We have been irritated by your reticence these past few years, but under the itchy surface we knew that it was all right, that the work was progressing, that the heart was still there, and the warm being we have known and cherished. I can understand now, as I could guess then, the somber note in you during our last meetings. There is a weight in such a venture which few men in history have had to bear. I know that with your love of men, it is no light thing to have had a part, and a great part, in a diabolical contrivance for destroying them. But in the possibilities of death are also the possibilities of life. You have made history. We are happy for you.
You may well ask why people with a kind heart and humanist feelings, why they would go and work on weapons of mass destruction.
When J. Robert Oppenheimer was born in 1904, the atomic bomb was not yet even science fiction. He was educated at the Ethical Culture School in New York and mastered Harvard's curriculum in 3 years, summa cum laude. He spoke 6 languages and seriously considered becoming an architect, a poet, or a scientist. But it was his love of physics that led him to England and Germany in the 1920s, where the atom was beginning to yield its secrets to Einstein, Rutherford, and Bohr. European scientists would later remember him as the quick and eccentric young American who devoured both theoretical physics and 16th century French poetry. One of his best friends was the young American writer, Francis Ferguson.
Well, when I first knew him, he knew nothing about politics. He never read the newspaper. He was extremely ignorant about practical matters, and he didn't care about them. his whole life was in the intellect.
At the age of 25, he accepted an unusual dual professorship at the University of California at Berkeley and at Caltech in Pasadena. He brought with him the radically new understanding of the atom and the principles of quantum mechanics.
Quantum mechanics was comparatively new then, and he was opening a new world to them, and he made it tremendously exciting and fascinating to them. And in fact, very few of them didn't come back and take it a second year.
One of his graduate students was Robert Serber.
I think there was, I remember one Russian lady, Miss Kokcharova, her name was, who had taken it 3 times. In the 4th year, she wanted to come back, and Robert refused to allow her into the course. She went on a hunger strike and forced her way in.
Something that might have taken me months to have learned before, he would go over in minutes. And
Robert Wilson, physicist.
Very fast clip and very elegant manner.
He was extremely quick and very impatient and had a very sharp tongue, which he used on people. He actually terrorized the students when he first began to teach. They were afraid to come into the same room for fear of a nasty remark.
Robert Oppenheimer and his younger brother Frank were born into a wealthy family and raised in New York City. Throughout the 1930s, they spent their summers with friends at a small ranch leased by the Oppenheimer family, high in the Pecos wilderness of northern New Mexico.
When we first went there, we slept on the floor, a board floor, and we didn't have enough covers, and we were pretty frozen by morning. But that didn't bother Robert much. He was a fairly hardy fellow, although he didn't look that way. He looked terribly frail, but he was pretty tough. He eventually explored a large part of those mountains, probably knew more about them than almost anybody else. And he would just get on his horse and put a chocolate bar in his pocket and be gone for a day or two at least, sleeping out. Probably would see nobody else during the whole trip.
Everything my brother did would sort of be special. If he went off in the woods to take a leak, he'd come back with a flower. And not to disguise the fact that it might leak, but just to make it an occasion, I guess. It was a wonderful time for all of us. All the different guests, most of them physicists, brought some ideas and new ideas with them. Also, the meals were sort of strange, sort of peanut butter and Vienna sausages and whiskey. And we'd get sort of drunk when we were high up, and we'd all act kind of silly, I guess.
I've never been on a horse in my life. They gave us maps and they sent us off on this 3-day trip over the mountain. Mountain passes are 12,500 feet. We went out with an absolute minimum of equipment. A bottle of whiskey and some graham crackers and food and oats for the horses.
It was the rainy season. Finally, we noticed it didn't rain quite as much at night. So we started to ride at night. And I don't know what we gained from riding at night, because it also rained at night.
Imagine this, you're riding on a mountain ridge at midnight, in the middle of a thunderstorm, with lightning hitting all around you. You come to a fork in the road, in the trail, and Robert says, this way it's only 7 miles home. This way it's a little longer, but it's much more beautiful.
But far from the Pecos wilderness, far from Berkeley, was Adolf Hitler. And Robert Oppenheimer was a Jew with friends and relatives in Germany.
He did not keep up with current events. He read novels, or he read philosophy books or serious books. But all of a sudden, and I think it was due in large part to Hitler and to the Nazi persecution of the Jews, that he suddenly, I think it must have been fairly suddenly, he suddenly realized that things were getting out of hand and that something had to be done about it by serious people. So he began reading.
Håkon Chevalier was a professor of French literature at Berkeley, active in left-wing causes. He and Oppenheimer grew to be close friends.
On one of his many trips to the East, on the train, he had taken 3 volumes of Das Kapital, and he had read them all in the original on his way to New York.
In German?
In German, yes. And then shortly after, apparently, he bought the complete works of Lenin and read those.
Pretty impressive, right? Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
So, Jon, you made a pretty powerful choice to set the tone of this film, right, in a more personal kind of way.
I mean, you know, in this, what I call this cascade of Oppenheimer stories, everyone who takes up the story, and I hope there will be more people, you know, these stories have to be retold every generation. You know, you have to figure out where you're going to enter the story, you know, at what point, and then you have to figure out what's sort of the basic forward motion of the story. And in this case, we were going to originally structure this around the security hearing, just like Christopher Nolan later did. And we ended up making a choice to be chronological. So the film, after the opening in which Håkon Chevalier reads that very powerful letter to Oppie after Hiroshima, we go back to day 1, and we work our way all the way through up to the Oppenheimer's death in 67. Is that when he, yeah, I think 67. You also have to find some core idea, some theme that's going to drive you through. And in this case, it's exactly the question that Hans Bethe asks at the very beginning of the film, which had puzzled me for most of my adult life. You may well ask how people with kind hearts and humanist feelings, how are they going to work on weapons of mass destruction? And that apparent contradiction really stays with us through the whole movie. I mean, I grew up in a time when, and a place and a culture in which, you know, kind of anyone who had anything to do with nuclear weapons was kind of maybe a bad person. And I grew up in a household that was, you know, my dad was a college professor, and, you know, there was some 16th century French poetry and all that hoity-toity elitist stuff. So I just got very, very interested in the contradiction. And we lucked out. I mean, there's some things, I was blessed with the fact that these people were still alive. Not only still alive, but they were all in vibrant middle age. No one had ever asked them to tell these stories on camera. So this, as far as I know, is the first time that any of them went on camera to tell these. I mean, Håkon Chevalier, my wife, of course, knew I was working on a film about Oppenheimer. Somehow the name Håkon Chevalier came up. A Frenchman who had actually gone into exile. He had left the United States and gone to France. My wife's mother, my mother-in-law, looked up Håkon Chevalier in the Paris phone book and found a number and called it and invited him over for supper.
And there he is, right?
Yeah, so by the time I got to meet Håkon Chevalier, he was also already fast buddies with my mother-in-law, yeah.
Can you, so you also work with Frank Oppenheimer, J. Robert's younger brother in this film. You worked with him again a few years after this, right?
Yeah, Frank was sort of the anti-Robert. I mean, I don't mean that he was opposed to Robert. They had a great love for each other and were very, very close. But Robert was sort of theatrically charismatic. He was sort of this operatic figure. We say at the beginning that he was a kind and eloquent, gentle and eloquent. He certainly was not verbally gentle. He could be very, very fierce. Frank was the opposite. Frank was also a physicist, an experimental physicist, by all accounts a very, very good one. He had worked at Los Alamos, of course, with his brother. After the war, he walked away from nuclear weapons. He had been a member of the Communist Party in the 30s. He was blacklisted. It had a happy ending that he ended up devoting the rest of his life to public education about science, much as you folks are.
Yeah.
I have to say, parenthetically, I wouldn't be here if I didn't feel that the work this museum is doing is incredibly important. This history that they're documenting here is, I think, some of the most important history of our nation. And so, boy,
thank you, John.
Keep up the good work. You're right, you're in good company with Frank Oppenheimer. Frank founded the Exploratorium in San Francisco, which it may, to this day, still be the best hands-on science museum in the world.
Absolutely.
And Frank and I became, very, very good friends, and we got to know the family, and yeah.
So you mentioned that J. Robert was kind of operatic figure, and that kind of leads right into your next film that you did surrounding this story. This is Wonders Are Many, The Making of Dr. Atomic. Can you tell us a little bit about what this film is before we see a clip?
Well, I finished Day After Trinity, and I thought I was all done with it. Actually, the very first purchase of a print of The Day After Trinity was, I got a purchase order from the Central Intelligence Agency. I thought, wow. And I gave the purchase order to Frank Oppenheimer. That was sort of the period of that was the end of my Oppenheimer experience. And then I heard that there were these two guys, composer Jon Adams and stage director Peter Sellers. I heard that they were going to make an opera about Oppenheimer, and I thought, this is too good to pass up. If I have a chance to film two other guys struggling to make this story, boy, that's like catnip. So yeah, I called up Jon Adams, and he said yeah, and it turned out, unbeknownst to me, that they were actually using some lines from The Day After Trinity, a number of lines from The Day After Trinity in their opera. So we became fast friends, and we spent about 6 months behind the scenes. Wow. Well, let's have a look at it.
Let's take a look.
This also is about, I think, an 8-minute clip, something like that.
Yeah.
Is it true that humans have already discovered a method of destroying humanity?
Well, I suppose that really has always been true. You could always beat everybody to death. You mean to do it by inadvertence?
Yes.
Not quite. Not quite. You can certainly destroy enough of humanity so that only the greatest act of faith can persuade you that what's left will be human.
When Robert Oppenheimer died in 1967, he left behind thousands of pages of official correspondence, memos, scientific papers, and a few poems. But he left no diary and no autobiography. In the desert, you can still find relics and ruins of the arms race he helped start and then tried to stop. He wrote no account of his own life, so others are left to tell his story, and the story of the bombs he created.
Throw me you went down to a D instead of an F. There's never been an opera like this, a mixture of things that people really said and poetry.
Take me to you, imprison me, for I...
Dr. Atomic is a little surprising because it includes a lot of classified material that has become declassified just in the last years, and also tries to put a human face, of course, on the human beings who created it.
I'm not surprised that you make an opera out of Oppenheimer, because he was, in a way, a sort of an operatic figure. He loved to be a little bit mysterious, a little bit larger than life, so to strut around on stage rather than just to walk. There's no doubt at all that Oppenheimer never regretted having built the bomb, and he thought that the mistakes were all made afterwards. In his last 6 months, he really became human. Everybody knew he was dying, and he became soft and friendly and just a much more attractive person altogether. I felt very close to him just in those 6 months.
Did he talk about nuclear weapons?
No. It's natural that when people are still alive, you don't talk about history. You only think of that after they died.
So, blending opera, thank you.
Thank you.
Blending opera and the story of the world's first atomic bomb. I think the first time you hear it kind of makes you scratch your head, but I mean, in your opinion, does it really seem to work?
Yeah. I mean, well, I mean, it's for the audience to decide whether this film works. Mm. The opera, I think, does work. You know, it did not work when it premiered. It had a lot of problems. But, you know, unlike a lot of other art forms, if you write an opera, you can change it after the premiere. So they changed a lot of things. I think it's a brilliant piece of work, especially the music you hear with this opening, the baritone singing, is actually singing the poem by John Donne, Batter My Heart, Three-Person God, that Oppenheimer had in his pocket at Trinity site. And we revisit that song in many forms throughout the film. We had the advantage in this case, you know, I said these stories have to be told anew once every generation. Well, this is actually, I got to do it twice. Right, and this is about a generation after the day after Trinity. A lot of time had passed. The day after Trinity was done during the height of the Cold War. This film was made in the post-Cold War, treaty-heavy time. It was also made in the wake of 9/11, the attacks on the World Trade Center. Another thing that had changed was that there was a lot of archive material, interviews and whatnot with Robert Oppenheimer, and a lot of nuclear testing archive material that Peter Coran had uncovered and restored that had not been available the first time around. So I was able to go back and kind of go back to the smorgasbord again and have new stuff. I have to say, parenthetically, there is a new interview with Robert Oppenheimer that I had never seen before that was just released in an MSNBC documentary. There's a famous Oppenheimer quote about the physicists have known sin, and there's a lot of controversy about that. And in this new interview, which is right before he died, he said people misunderstand what I meant by that. What I meant was it was the sin of pride. We thought we knew what was good for mankind, which I thought, I wish I had had that interview from him for either of these films, both of them. Yeah.
Well, so we're going to take a look at a few more clips from Jon's work, and right now we'll bounce back to the day after Trinity and watch a short one here. Yeah. So let's dive back in.
I was caught up in the war effort and with a patriotic fever that's hard to imagine nowadays. It's been so long since anything of that kind has motivated seems to have motivated Americans, and one would have done anything that was necessary to get on with the war.
The bomb project had a sudden urgency. The U.S. Army was given charge and codenamed it the Manhattan District, with General Leslie Groves in command, and secret laboratories scattered across the country. Groves put Oppenheimer in charge of a group at Berkeley to explore the basic scientific requirements of an atomic bomb. Oppenheimer, who had taken to wearing a rakish pork pie hat, took pleasure in his new official title, Coordinator of Rapid Rupture.
That was the time when the big change in his life occurred. And it must have been during that time that the dream somehow got hold of him of really producing a nuclear weapon, which other people had been talking about, that he was the fellow who really did it.
It is a very different attitude if you want to find out the deep secrets of nature, which is what he had wanted to do before. And on the other hand, if you want to produce something, to produce a mechanism that works. It was a different problem, different attitude, and he completely changed to fit the new role.
We'll skip the cut and paste.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. Coordinator of Rapid Rupture is quite the title. But as the film points out, this is a shift in his life, right?
Yeah, it's a big shift. I should say also with concerning Rapid Rupture, another thing we did differently, I decided very deliberately with the day after Trinity that we could not do any of the science. We just had so much on our plate to get this first basic story of this fascinating man out there that we couldn't do any science. In Wonders Are Many, which was 20 years later, there was enough public understanding of Oppenheimer that we decided we could take on a little bit of the science. So that was a challenge to do Oppenheimer's story and opera and science. So
just a little bit.
Is this
right?
the plutonium chorus coming up?
Yeah. So we're gonna.
Well, you guys will tell us if we succeeded or not. I have to say, by the way, there's a quiz built into this evening. There is a technical error. There's a technical error which only this audience will notice.
All right.
Sometime between now and the end of the evening.
So we're going to go back to Wonders Are Many, and we'll take a look at a couple more clips from that. So here we go.
One of the things about the nuclear bomb that's so puzzling is that it's so sexy. I mean, the image of the cloud is both terrifying and fearsome, and it's also very beautiful. And this plutonium sphere, this sphere that was made of this, man-made material that was unbelievably toxic and at the same time precious. And this is how the fuse was designed around the plutonium globe. We surround the plutonium core from 32 points spaced equally around its surface. The 32 points are the centers of the 20 triangular faces of an isosahedron, interwoven with the 12 pentagonal faces of a dodecahedron. We squeeze the sphere, bring the atoms closer, till the subcritical mass goes supercritical. It's almost as good as Baudelaire.
20 triangular faces of an icosahedron. That's very scientific. Now, the women found this very intriguing to sing and to learn.
We surround the plutonium core from 32 points.
This whole vast 5-foot ball of explosives, which looks like a giant soccer ball, was organized in the most efficient way to put blocks of material into a spherical form, pentagons and hexagons, dodecahedrons and icosahedrons.
Love this bit. Interwoven with the 12 pentagonal faces Dodecahedron. Very engaging music.
Large blocks of high explosive arranged around a sphere of plutonium. To squeeze a ball of plutonium, a solid mass of plutonium actually, down to from the size of an orange down to the size of an eyeball, less than half its original size, and of course increase its density. So if everything worked right, it would just squeeze in and in and in, and squeeze the ball to solidity and crush the initiator, and boom, off the chain reaction would go.
The point is that when you have a lump of plutonium and you have a neutron wandering around in the lump, two things can happen. That either a neutron hits the plutonium atom and makes it fission and produces 3 more neutrons, or it escapes. So whether the thing explodes like a bomb just depends on how many of the neutrons actually get caught in the plutonium and how many escape. So clearly, if you compress the plutonium, make it denser, then it increases the chance that the neutron gets caught and produces more fissions, and decreases the chance that it escapes. So it's really that simple, that so by squeezing it, you make the explosion much more likely. That's how the plutonium bomb works. And there's nothing secret about that.
We are going to go back and do the squeeze the you-know-what. One more time. Ladies, the plutonium core, even more amazing virginal tone. Really feel like it's almost a girls' course, young women. Just really let the tone of it have this lightness and beauty and innocence and purity to it.
A bomb can be made of either plutonium or enriched uranium. A pound of plutonium can release 30 million times the energy of a pound of dynamite. Plutonium does not exist in nature, is warm to the touch, has a half-life of 24,000 years, and is named for the Greek god Pluto, god of the underworld.
When I saw the pictures on the television on September 11th, 2001, I thought immediately, thank God that's not plutonium this time. Because we had thought of this World Trade Center as being a prime target long, long before. I mean, it was obviously the prime target. But we had always thought it would be a nuclear attack. It would have killed immediately 10 times as many people. It would have left the whole area a stinking radioactive ruin.
All of Manhattan?
No, but the area of the World Trade Center. It would have probably killed 1 million people, I would guess, altogether. So compared with that, what actually happened was a pinprick.
We're going to look at just one more, just kind of right behind this one. So.
Only a decade after the Trinity test, the Atomic Energy Commission would build a miniature civilization on a dry lake bed in Nevada and then explode one Hiroshima-sized bomb to test what might survive. Shelters, parking garages, railroads, houses, gas stations, a little forest, farm animals, even a bank. They filled the bank vault with paper to test whether stocks and bonds and insurance policies could survive nuclear war. That same year, Edward Teller would propose sending algae and bacteria on a rocket to Mars in case of nuclear annihilation on Earth. It all began in the summer of 1945.
of the clip. I just wanted to point out that the guys who did the opera, well, thank you. The guys who did the opera decided not to use the famous Oppenheimer quote from the Bhagavad Gita about I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. They decided instead to use this passage in which expresses awe at the sight of this, what is it, the sight of this splendor, your shape stupendous, and made this big powerhouse Wagnerian chorus about it. Yeah, we probably, yeah, go ahead.
There's also sorry about that. My battery's low. Thank you. Well, that was the first time that I had heard a chorus sing about a plutonium core. I don't know about the rest of you. But looks like I'm back, John. There you go. But that was interesting to see how they found, ways to take the science and incorporate it in.
Yeah.
And then you had a scientist over top of that explaining this really complicated thing, but doing it in the...
Yeah, that, by the way, is Richard Rhodes, who wrote The Making of the Atomic Bomb, who's giving a lecture about the plutonium core.
So we've got one final clip of John's work, and then after that, we'll open it up to all of you to join in the conversation. But we'll go back to not Wonders Are Many, but the day after Trinity. So let's take a look.
The test was set at midnight. The prediction was there'd be 60-mile visibility and a certain wind pattern. Well, at midnight, it was raining cats and dogs, lightning and thunder. Really scared about this object there in the tower. It'd be set off accidentally. So you can imagine the strain on Oppenheimer, on Robert Oppenheimer, this.
I remember it was one of my memories of that time having to go up the tower to turn on a piece of equipment. So I was one of the last, not the last person by any means, but one of the last people to get our equipment that was right next to the bomb, have it all turned on and tested before starting the test. And it was quite dramatic because lightning was striking all around. It was quite a fierce storm going on. And in particular, one had a certain amount of respect for that atomic bomb being right next as sparks seemed to be flying. Did give me a little bit of a sense of apprehension.
I think he and I were lying down right next to each other, flat in the desert, right outside the control hut at the time the bomb went off.
And we had prepared ourselves with glass, and when we could hear the countdown, when it went off, we all were looking through the glass, and then we saw what was just a tremendous, overpowering vision of this thing happening, seeing the mountains small beside it, seeing perhaps with some kind of beauty, but awesome was what I would call it as it slowly developed, went up in the air, and made the whole desert light up as at noon and appear small. A large desert rimmed by mountains appear to be a small place. And that was just something that once that had happened, I was a different person from then on.
At the time it went off, it was, I think, absolutely, it wasn't, I knew sort of what would happen, but I didn't expect the heat from the flash at 5 miles away to be nearly that intense. And then there was a cloud, sort of the radioactive cloud went and sort of hovered there. And I and Ken had been working on developing escape routes, because if that thing had gone a little bit south, it would have fall out on the camp, and we would have had to get out to the south rather than where the north was. The road was to the north. And so there was this sense of this ominous cloud hanging over us. It was so brilliant purple with all the radioactive glowing. And it just seemed to hang there forever. Of course, it didn't. It must have been just a very short time until it went up. But it was very terrifying. And the thunder from the blast, it bounced on the rocks and then went, I don't know where else it bounced, but it never seemed to stop. Not like an ordinary echo of a thunder. It just kept echoing back and forth in that Jornada de Muerte. It was a very scary time when it went off. And God, I wish I could remember what my brother said, but I can't. But I think we just said it worked. I think that's what we said, both of us. It worked, and nobody knew it was going to work.
He was in the forward bunker, and then when he came back, there he was, you know, with his hat. You've seen pictures that Robert's hat and so on, and he came to where we were in the headquarters, so to speak. And the way his walk was like high noon. I think it's the best I could describe it, this kind of strut. He'd done it.
It felt like an earthquake. We lived in a good adobe house, and it just said, shh. And he said, my goodness, that's an earthquake, and wonder if it hurt the house. And he got out of bed, and he got up, and he says, I want you to come look. The sun's rising in the wrong direction.
Must have been nearly 20 miles away. Well, this is if somebody had set off a flash bulb right in your face. And completely blinded for about 30 seconds. Then gradually your vision cleared and you saw this huge orange and purple and green violently colored balls rolling up towards the sky.
So we knew something had happened over here, and we had a car along, had a radio in it. So we kept that radio on, and along at noon they up and told us, you know, that there's an ammunition dump went off.
We were headed up to Albuquerque to take her back to school, and we were between Polvadera and Limitar when we saw this great big flash of light. And my sister, she said, what happened? And that was, she got to see the light, and it just seemed like it lit up the whole prairie all around us.
Was there anything odd about your sister asking about the light?
Yes, because she was blind.
It didn't take very long. I was just after the first few minutes that I realized sort of viscerally what had happened, and had goose flesh all over of the consequences of what would happen to the world.
When did you find out what happened?
Well, it was quite a while, you know, until they began to talk about the cattle, you know, that their hair was turning white on them, like frost, you know. It looked like they had frost on their backs and so forth.
The way we noticed them was where that fallout fell on the cow. If she's lying on her left side, while her right side would get burned, and the particles of dust that were radioactive would fall on her, and then they caused a burn like a scald, and the hair, instead of coming back red, like on a Hereford cow, would come back white, just like a saddle burn on a black horse. And old man Mac Smith that had the white store up there had a black cat just as black as the ace of spades. And that thing had white spots all over it after the atomic blast. He sold it to some tourist for $5, I think, as a curiosity.
Wow. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
So John, again, thank you so much for sharing your wonderful films with us. Guys, you probably noticed some microphones came down from the ceiling there. Oh, extra echo now. But yeah, we want to open this up to all of you. So if anybody has a question or comment, a story about what we saw this evening or anything for John, please feel free. So anyone with a question?
I'm going to pull rank.
Yep. Okay. Rob McCoy, CEO of the Atomic Museum, pulling rank.
As you know, John, with the release of Nolan's film last summer, it has been an absolute boon for our museum.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
You also know that film was based on what's considered the Bible
of
Oppenheimer, American Prometheus. What did you think of Christopher Nolan's film?
Let me first say, I think if there is a definitive Oppenheimer, it is in fact American Prometheus. Martin Sherwin and Kai Bird's book. Martin Sherwin, by the way, was an advisor, young Martin Sherwin, on the day after Trinity. I like Nolan's film a lot, I have to say. I mean, hats off to Christopher Nolan for tackling this extremely complicated story and keeping us pretty much on the edge of our chairs for 3 hours. I mean, I think that, anything that keeps nuclear weapons in the public imagination is good. I think that, I've lived long enough to see the sense that the weapons are out there, to see that sense sort of drift away. I don't want to remake someone else's film, but since Chris Nolan's film made $1 billion, I'm going to go ahead and I wish they had shown what happened on the ground in Hiroshima. Mm-hmm. I felt that was, in some ways, a very odd choice. There is, if you recall in the film, a scene in which Robert Oppenheimer and the scientists, after the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they're watching a slideshow, which is off camera, and which is clearly of what happened to human bodies on the ground. We see Oppenheimer's face, but we never see those slides. There's a big scene in The Day After Trinity that we're not going to look at tonight, in which we were able to use footage that had just been released, believe it or not, 25 years after the fact, of Hiroshima survivors. I found Robert Wilson, who appears in some of these clips, Los Alamos scientist, was an important scientist, and he was an important fellow who kind of called the question. He convened this famous evening seminar at Los Alamos called the Gadget and the Future of Civilization. Robert Wilson in the film has been replaced by a senior woman physicist, and there were no women in senior positions at Los Alamos. And I think that's an interesting thing that we need to remember about that period, is that these weapons were conceived and built entirely by men. And you can make of that what you will, but I think it was sort of disingenuous to be kind of politically correct and turn that person into a woman. There's a bunch of little factual, mistakes, but on the balance, I really liked the film.
Anyone else with a question or comment for Jon? Yes, sir.
You've really whetted our appetite. Where are they available?
You can actually. They were unavailable for a long time. The Day After Trinity was out of print. You just go on Amazon. Don't get a bootleg copy. I want you to pay $3. If Chris Nolan's film can make $1 billion, I want to make $100 this year. They're on Amazon. Full disclosure, you can actually get The Day After Trinity for free in 3 parts on the Internet Archive, but don't do it. Yeah.
Anyone else? Yes, up in the back there.
Hi. I'm absolutely fascinated when I first arrived in Las Vegas, the local area, and went to visit the Hoover Dam. And the Hoover Dam was built at a time when man felt that he could conquer nature. And there's a huge spirit of that conquering of nature, and that's been followed up by some of the technology, if you like, from the nuclear industry and the things that you're showing us now. The title of the lecture this evening was concerning artificial intelligence and where intelligence is actually real or human. And I just wondered how you see the next conquest.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, Matt and I were just talking about this actually. If your question is, do I see AI as sort of in the 3 horsemen of climate change, nuclear weapons, and AI? I don't know. I'm not an expert. I will say that I live in Silicon Valley, and AI is fiercely driven by profit. I mean, it is just, you talk about unregulated capitalist, avarice. That was not the case with nuclear weapons. Of course, there are defense contractors, and we can have big debates about the cost of all this stuff during my lifetime and what could have been done with some of that money. But I think that sets AI apart. But whether it's going to rise to the level of a nuclear threat or climate change, I can't say.
Yes, sir.
I really don't. I mean, I try to keep up on this, but the only place I can claim any sort of meager expertise is stuff that happened a long time ago. I'm concerned, obviously, especially with the recent developments. Yeah. Did anybody find I found 2 more technical errors, by the way, while I was watching this.
Let's see. Yeah. So.
Since we were talking about telling the story to every generation so they understand,
Yeah.
I got from your documentary the heart of why we were afraid, and that we looked at this. We were afraid for the end of Western civilization. And I don't know that the younger generations get that yet. Mm-hmm. Do you feel like the movie Oppenheimer made that evident, or as clear in it as I feel like you did in your documentary?
You talking about Nolan's film? Yeah. To some degree, because it has a rather kind of bizarre ending where all of a sudden the rockets are launched and we're apparently in a nuclear conflagration. I mean, I have to say that I view this whole last 78 years as a great success story. And that may surprise you, but I mean, my grandparents were born in the 19th century, and they lived to see, Castle Bravo and newsreels and to watch live tests at NTS. And if you dive back into public culture, the public imagination in the 1950s, and if you look at the war plans in the 1950s, it would be absurdly optimistic to think that we would be here on this lovely evening in Las Vegas not having blown each other apart. So I have to say, I know that's not your question, but I really do view this as a success story, and it's a success story brought about by incredible hard work over decades by deterrence and by arms control. I mean, I really feel that that's worked, and I feel blessed to have lived at this little period in human history. I lost track of the question. Oh, generations. Yeah, I mean, I think, we have to renew this, unfortunately. I don't want my kids to have to think about nuclear weapons, but on the other hand, I want my grandchildren to know that they exist. A bigger problem for me, actually, generational problem, is that there are now, nowhere in the world is anyone actively involved in the planning of nuclear strategy or tactics ever experienced a nuclear weapon. If you think about that for a moment. I mean, there are plenty of people around. I met with a bunch of wonderful fellows today who had experienced lots of underground shots, and there's still some people who have witnessed and felt the visceral terror of atmospheric shots, but no one who's making any of the planning. And I think that's probably a problem. I mean, I don't want to get into whether we should resume testing or not, but that I think is, well, I won't dig a hole for myself. I think that's a problem.
I just don't want the younger generations to think we were just only concerned about ourselves and not humankind.
Yeah.
Because I think what the gentleman said in your documentary is that it's been a long time since we've had anything like that happen here in the country that might have made us feel that way.
Yeah.
Anyone else with a question or comment? Yeah, Brad.
Sometimes some of the best stories are those that we don't tell. So I'm curious if there's a story in Oppenheimer that you weren't able to tell, or if there's a documentary that you are wanting to tell but you haven't been able to.
Oh boy, great question. Oh, I think you're asking, was there something in Oppenheimer's story that we wanted to tell but didn't, correct? Yeah, we wanted to do the hearing. I mean, there was this infamous security hearing in which Robert Oppenheimer's clearance was not restored. in 1954. And it was a kangaroo court. It was done in secret. It was Secretary of Energy Granholm recently vacated that decision. I would love to have built the film around that, and that's exactly what happens in Christopher Nolan's film. And part of the reason I would have loved to do it is that in that hearing, that secret closed hearing in Washington, D.C., Oppenheimer began with a statement which was in fact an autobiography. And we could have just laid out his whole life in his own words. But the problem was that there was not one single still photo image of that hearing, nor was there any audio recording that anyone's ever found, nor was there any film shot. Now, if you're a Hollywood film producer, you can hire actors and you can do what they did in the hearing, and you can space it out throughout your 3 hours and make a magnificent narrative that way. I wish we had done that. There are two people who are, well, you haven't seen the whole film. If you see the whole film of Day After Trinity, there are two people who are absent. And you think, I wonder why Dr. Teller's not in this movie. And I wonder why Richard Feynman's not in this movie. Well, I had done camera work on a big public television film about Edward Teller the year before I directed this film. And Teller, I met with him a couple of times about being in this film. He agreed to be in The Day After Trinity. And the week before we were to film him, this other public television program was broadcast. And it was a complete hatchet job. I mean, whatever you think of Edward Teller, and there are a lot of opinions about Edward Teller, it was really an unfair hatchet job on Teller. And he wrote me a letter and said, I'm not getting anywhere near public television ever again. And he never did. So that's why Teller's not in. Feynman I spoke to on the phone a couple times, and if you've never heard Richard Feynman talk about Los Alamos, I urge you, if you want to get entertained, just go on the internet and get the Feynman lectures about physics and then about, anyhow, we couldn't afford it. You know, this is public television, and if I could have had, another $10,000 that went into one of those weapons, we would have flown our crew down to Caltech and done Richard Feynman, but we just literally ran out of money, and I just kicked myself, and I should have mortgaged my house, and,
Anyone else have a question or comment for John? Yes.
My question is, did anyone ever try to do anything after Oppenheimer lost his security clearance? What happened to him? Did he continue to teach?
Oppenheimer himself, the man? Well, he was no pacifist, and he did not abandon nuclear weapons after the Japanese surrender. He was very involved in the development and testing and planning for small nuclear weapons. Up until 1954, he was an advisor to the Atomic Energy Commission. He was on the General Advisory Committee. He became very embroiled in the debate over the hydrogen bomb. He opposed the development of the super. And he was finally, I don't know how else to say it, he was silenced. He had told some fibs and lies and said some stupid things back in the 1930s and during the war that allowed this hearing board to not restore his security clearance. And he was no longer part of the national conversation about nuclear weapons. He was sort of a public intellectual and gave speeches and whatnot, but and then he died of throat cancer. He smoked about 4 packs of cigarettes a day, and he died of throat cancer, I think in '67. Yeah. Does that answer the question?
Yes, I just knew that he had something to do with the hydrogen bomb, but I wasn't sure how far he had gone into the hydrogen in the small bombs.
Anybody find the technical mistakes? No?
No.
Oh, man.
That was Nevada. That was wrong.
Say what?
Nevada, yeah. It's a room full of locals, right? So.
Nevada, okay.
There was one in the libretto where it was talking about the 32 points, and the third sentence said 30.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm going to
typo.
add that to my list of failures. Okay.
When he mentions
John. No, Hedron. I thought he said 20 sides, but I don't think that was right.
Say that again.
I think he said 20 sides to a dodecahedron.
Oh, okay, yeah. Okay, yeah, good, yeah. Well, the Priscilla shot, which is the one for which all that wreckage out at the site was built, was 37 kilotons. It was not the same as Hiroshima. And then when the Trinity shot goes off, we have the sound arriving at the exact microsecond of the blast, which, you know, I mean, it took, I don't know, it was 5 miles, so what is that, I don't know, 4 to 6 seconds, something like that, something there.
Right. Well, and then the experience of a lot of us in the West of actual earthquake.
Yeah.
We know that, you know, you often hear it, and you hear it approaching, and then the shake or the jolt or the up and down that happens afterwards. But it was so impressive to see the projection of that, even though the sound was at the same time, that to me, I really had a sensation of that movement, and the you know, at least being unsettled, but really that that fear that you get during an earthquake because there's no control.
Yeah, I think that's what Robert Wilson is trying to express when he talks about the mountains being made small. You know, I love that image that it just made him feel insignificant. Yeah. Before I forget, since you in front of this audience, I'm actually writing a book now about the Priscilla shot in 1957, and somewhat about underground testing after the '63 treaty. I think we have at some point my email address up on the screen. Yep. If you have anything you want to talk about having to do with Priscilla or the test site or underground testing, shoot me an email and we'll talk.
Great. Bill, did I see your hand? Yeah, go ahead, sir.
Well, I had a couple of comments and a question kind of relating to the science of these things. But first off, I'd like to say I was born about a few blocks from here. Great. In 1953, over 70 years ago. And my father had an office in what is now the Mob Museum prior to 53, before I was born. And he used to tell us stories, because that was the tallest building in Las Vegas, was the Mob Museum. It was a federal building. And he had an office in there, worked for the federal government. And my older sisters and my older brother and my family, before I was born, a few years before I was born, would stand on top of that building. And they would look to the north and to the west, or whatever it is, up toward the test site, and they told me about it. But I remember when I was about 8 years old, also looking, I was knee-high to my dad, so I never actually saw an atom bomb, but my family did, my sister did. Okay. But my science question is, this bomb that you were talking about was plutonium, right? This one we saw a picture of. Was the one over Hiroshima, first question is, was that plutonium?
That was enriched uranium.
That was enriched.
Scientists in the crowd, please correct me if I'm wrong. That was the uranium bomb.
Okay. So my second question, because we don't hear about plutonium like Iran trying to create an atom bomb with plutonium. We talk about them trying to enrich uranium. What does it mean to enrich uranium?
Boy, it's not my field of expertise. My understanding is that the idea of enriching uranium is to separate and collect and concentrate as many U-235 atoms as you can. Is that correct, scientists? Yes. Okay. And they will fission much more easily than all the U-238 and 230, whatever the other 230s are. Yeah, I would take that up with scientific expertise in the room.
I had an opportunity to talk to who was a president of the United States and may very possibly be our next president, on a one-on-one conversation last year, talking about North Korea.
Mm-hmm.
And he told me that his works with President Un, that the uranium concentrations that are found in North Korea are some of the best and biggest in the world.
That may be, I don't know. I know that when the Manhattan Project launched, General Groves cornered the world's supply of uranium, which at the time was thought to be very, very small. There were some mines in the Congo, I think a mine in Czechoslovakia. It turns out that uranium is fairly common around the face of the earth. Again, it's out of my area of expertise, but I think it's a little easier to get uranium than it used to be.
Actually, most of the uranium from the Manhattan Project came from the Belgian Congo.
Came from?
Belgian Congo.
Yeah.
At the time, it was Belgian. The Belgians gave it to the United States.
Yeah, I think that was also the site of the only known spontaneous fission was in that mine. It was like 10,000 years ago, 15,000.
The Oklo reactor? The Oklo reactor?
Oh, no.
Yes.
That's new to me.
So, yeah, there was a natural configuration of uranium.
Ah,
its
okay.
concentration was enough where about 2 billion years ago,
Okay.
uranium-235 was about 3.5%, so it was fission.
Oh, okay, good. You've educated me, okay.
So you and all we team up there helping. So.
But the spontaneous fission, the first spontaneous fission was measured in uranium was measured in 1940 by Georgy Fledov at the time of the Radium Institute in Leningrad.
Well, everybody, again, thank you so much for joining us this evening. And John, thank you so much for doing that. We hope you enjoy the comics, guys. This is something that we set out to do every season or so, kind of quarterly. So we'll have another one coming up pretty shortly, an announcement on that. But again, thank you so much for coming in tonight. And we'll see you at the next ATOMIX or at the Atomic Museum. John's email is up on the screen if you have further comments.
I have.
I was just going to say she was.
I have